The air in the staging area outside CUC was thick enough to chew, but Sergeant Miller, known universally as Mouse, felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the tropical heat. He hated the waiting, surface warfare, the rush of adrenaline, the chaotic noise. That was honest. This mission was subterranean, 90 feet straight down, a calculated exercise in stillness that felt less like combat and more like self-burial. He was small, compact, and possessed the unnerving ability to hold his breath for times that seemed physiologically impossible. Captain Davies spread the grease-penciled map across the hood of the Jeep. This isn't a typical rabbit hole, Mouse. Recon picked up chatter about the Cathedral, high-value intel, possibly components for SA-2 guidance systems, maybe even NVA Central Committee documents. The entrance shaft is vertical, a drainage pipe they adapted. 90 feet, Mouse. Straight drop. And we believe they knew we'd find it eventually, meaning it's primed. Mouse wasn't looking at the map. He was examining the harness and the communication wire, a thin, insulated strand, his only link to the living world. Davies cleared his throat. We are authorizing chemical suppression if needed, but you go in cold. No firing unless absolutely necessary. Your primary mission is retrieval, not engagement. You have 15 minutes of operational time down there before the humidity starts fouling the radio components, and the risk of the whole thing collapsing increases exponentially. The biggest threat isn't the VC. It's the lack of structural integrity that deep. If the ground shifts, or if you make one wrong move, 90 feet of earth becomes 90 feet of coffin. We need silence, Mouse. Total silence. Anything else registers as combat, and we pull the plug. Do you understand the parameters? Mouse nodded once, the sweat already stinging his eyes, anticipating the profound darkness that was his domain, knowing the sound of a shovel full of wet earth was what truly terrified him. The vertical descent was the worst part of the mission. It wasn't the darkness, which was total and oppressive, nor the humidity, which quickly reached 100%, turning the air into soup. It was the sheer, terrifying distance, suspended only by the thin nylon rope and the knowledge that the smallest fraying strand meant a terminal velocity plunge into solid clay. Mouse secured his small pack, knife, .45 caliber pistol, chamber loaded, hammer down, and 2 pen lights to his webbing. The opening was just wide enough to squeeze through, an old concrete culvert buried decades ago. He kicked off the lip and began the slow, controlled rappel. 90 feet is an eternity when gravity is your enemy. The light from the jungle's surface diminished rapidly, shrinking into a sickly yellow coin, then vanishing completely, plunging him into a blackness so dense it felt physical. He could feel the cool, wet concrete scraping against his shoulder pads, transmitting every vibration from above, the distant rumble of artillery, the chirp of a cricket, all distorted into deep, unnatural groans. This waiting phase was critical. He had to descend at a pace that minimized dust and vibration, lest he trigger a seismic sensor or a delicately balanced booby trap set just a foot below the opening. The silence of the rope paying out was unnerving. His own breath, muffled by a cotton bandana, sounded like a hurricane. At roughly the 70-foot mark, the concrete shaft ended, yielding to smooth, packed earth, indicating the NVA had hand-dug the final 20 feet. The temperature dropped abruptly, and he felt a primal shudder of deep earth coldness. He counted the hand-over-hand movements, a ritual against panic, until his boots finally contacted something solid, flat, and unnervingly quiet, 90 feet below the surface of Vietnam. Mouse released the tension on the rope, settling onto the floor of a narrow, main artery. The air here was stale and mineral-rich, smelling strongly of sulfur and ancient, undisturbed clay. He ran his hand across the walls. The clay was baked hard, almost ceramic, confirming the age and sophistication of this system. It wasn't the rushed construction of the VC. This was NVA engineering, built to last. He activated his pen light, shielded by a filter to barely cast light 2 feet ahead. The tunnel branched immediately into a three-way junction, the crossroads of clay. To the left, water dripped rhythmically, suggesting a natural spring or drainage system, a likely dead end or trap. To the right, the passage was impossibly narrow, almost vertically supported, suggesting a combat crawlway. Ahead, the main tunnel continued, wider, clearly the route to the Cathedral. Mouse dropped to his stomach, ignoring the wider path first. He inspected the floor of the crawlway, looking for the telltale discoloration of disturbed earth. His fingers found it, a slight depression covered by a layer of fine, red dust designed to collapse into a deep water trap if stepped on directly. A non-lethal trap, designed not to kill, but to create a loud, distinctive splashing sound that would alert the deep sentries. He mentally logged the NVA strategy: prioritize awareness over immediate lethality. The waiting game was on their terms, deep inside the earth, where every mistake was amplified. He carefully traversed the lip of the water trap, his muscles screaming under the strain of absolute control, realizing that his ability to remain still was the only weapon he had against the earth itself. Mouse pressed forward into the main artery. The NVA had employed a strategy of complete auditory suppression. The tunnels were padded with woven straw mats in certain sections, muffling his already silent movements. This silence was more terrifying than a shouted warning. It meant the enemy was nearby, disciplined, and listening for the slightest anomaly. The pursuit was silent, a psychological chess match where the board was the damp earth. About 50 yards in, his searching hand brushed against something taut and thin, a tripwire. He froze instantly, heart hammering against his ribs, waiting for the inevitable detonation. Nothing. He used his fingertips to trace the wire. It led to a small, suspended leather bag, weighted with pebbles, hung just above a slight overhang. It was another alarm trap, non-lethal, designed to drop its contents onto the floor, creating a distinctive thud that only the deep defenders would recognize. Mouse carefully cut the wire, catching the bag before it could fall. The NVA wasn't trying to blow him up yet. They were tracking his movement, guiding him toward a specific, inescapable kill zone. He secured the bag of pebbles in his pocket, a morbid trophy, and continued his focus absolute. He felt a phantom heat on the back of his neck, the certainty that eyes were watching him from some hidden loop or ventilation shaft. Every minute spent moving was a minute less he had for the critical retrieval. He sped up his crawl slightly, accepting the increased risk of vibration, knowing that the cost of prolonged waiting might be death by asphyxiation 90 feet down. The tunnel suddenly opened into a vast, naturally formed pocket of rock and clay, the cauldron. This was a critical failure of NVA engineering, or perhaps a deliberate design. The acoustics were horrific. The chamber was large enough for 10 men to stand upright, but the rounded walls amplified sound, turning Mouse's measured inhale into a soft, yet audible rasp. This chamber felt like a psychological torture room. Mouse instinctively dropped against the far wall, pressing his body into the cool clay, integrating himself with the stillness of the earth. He extinguished his penlight. The mission demanded extreme waiting here. He had to be sure no alerted sentry was moving to intercept him from the side tunnels he couldn't see. He set his internal clock for 5 minutes of absolute stillness. 5 minutes in that echoing darkness, where his own internal sounds, the rush of blood in his ears, the violent thump of his heart, became roaring distractions. The duality of combat peaked here. The combat was not active. It was the war against his own biological imperative to move, to breathe deeply, to confirm his location. A single scrape of boot leather, a cough, or the metallic click of his pistol's safety being disengaged would immediately give away his position, turning the cauldron into a kill box. He focused on a microscopic speck of dust floating in the stagnant air, reducing his world to that single, suspended particle. The silence was so profound that when the drop of water finally struck the floor 10 feet away, the sound was a startling, sharp crack, nearly causing him to flinch, a near-fatal error of impatience. The 5 minutes dragged on, an eternity measured by the slow accumulation of sweat and the terrifying realization that he was utterly alone, encased by 90 feet of earth and enemy design. As the waiting ended, Mouse moved forward again, using the periphery of the cauldron. He found the entrance to the inner sanctum, a passage sealed by heavy, rain-warped timbers. He slid the timbers aside, careful not to let them scrape the clay floor, and squeezed through. The tunnel narrowed sharply, and immediately the air thickening. He could smell decaying paper and oil, the scent of high-value equipment. Just as he felt certain of success, the beam of his light revealed devastation. The tunnel ahead was partially collapsed, a section perhaps 15 feet long where the roof had splintered and fallen, leaving jagged shards of rock and loose earth piled high. The NVA hadn't cleared it. They had intentionally destabilized and partially collapsed this final corridor, creating a natural, highly volatile barrier. Retrieving the intelligence meant navigating a structurally compromised zone where the smallest vibration could bring the remaining ceiling down. This introduced a new layer of threat, distinguishing the sound of imminent enemy attack from the natural, fatal sounds of shifting earth. He tested the air. It felt hollow, unstable. He began the slow, agonizing process of clearing the rubble, using only his hands and the tip of his knife, pulling rocks away one by one, listening intently. Every soft thud of a displaced rock sounded like a massive gunshot in the narrow space. He paused, holding his breath again, convinced the shifting earth was giving way. He debated retreating. The mission was now suicidal. But the faint, complex smell of chemicals, not earth but ordnance, urged him forward. He realized the collapse wasn't just a barrier. It was concealing something far worse. He was 3 feet into the debris field, inching past a massive, angled slab of rock when he heard it. It was not the thud of falling earth, nor the rush of his own blood. It was a precise, high-pitched, metallic whisper, a sound utterly divorced from the natural environment. Faint, almost ultrasonic, but undeniably artificial. Mouse froze, his chest barely grazing the damp earth. His fingers clenched into the debris pile. He knew that sound. It was the soft, continuous release of gas from a pressure-triggered chemical fuse, a design used on large, strategic demolition charges. It meant the fuse was active, pressurized, and slowly leaking. The charge was positioned either within the collapsed rubble or directly above him, set to detonate if the ground pressure changed beyond a finely tuned tolerance. The hiss was his time clock. The movement he had just made, pushing aside the slab, had likely exacerbated the leak rate. He estimated he had seconds, maybe a minute, before the internal pressure dropped enough to trip the detonation mechanism, burying him and collapsing the 90-foot shaft behind him. He could not move forward, and he certainly could not retreat. His combat now was absolute, forced stillness inches from the sound of instant death. He could feel the slight, terrifying vibration of the gas exiting the valve, a metallic tremble running through the clay right next to his ear. The silence he had sought was shattered by this tiny, relentless sound, forcing a desperate, immediate, silent maneuver. With the hiss screaming in his ears, Mouse began the impossible task of disarmament. He realized the charge wasn't buried. It was fastened to the underside of the central stabilizing beam, secured by a complex bracket hidden just beneath the slab he had moved. The charge itself was enormous, likely 40 pounds of high explosive, enough to vaporize the immediate area. To disarm it, he needed to access the pressure cap without introducing any further vibrations. If he used force, the mercury switch would tip, or the remaining pressure would drop, and he would die instantly. He withdrew his specialized, non-magnetic carbon fiber knife, sliding it forward using only the muscles in his wrist, not his arm. He couldn't see the cap clearly. He had to rely on tactile memory and the exact angle of the hiss dash. His index finger gently located the pressure release valve. He knew he needed to maintain counterpressure while dislodging the internal pin. Any change in the environment, even a shift of air when he exhaled, felt catastrophic. He used the tip of his knife, inserting it into the microscopic space between the valve and the mounting plate. The scrape of carbon fiber on steel was almost silent, yet in the tunnel, it felt like a thunderclap. His hand cramped violently, a spasm he fought to suppress using sheer willpower. He applied the counterpressure, steadying the valve, then flicked the internal pin free. The hiss stopped instantly, replaced by a suffocating, dense silence. Mouse did not move for another full minute, waiting for the residual pressure to stabilize. Then slowly, agonizingly slowly, he removed the knife, allowing himself a single, shallow breath of relief. The way was clear, but the adrenaline crash hit Mouse hard. He pushed past the remaining rubble, finding a small, reinforced niche, the cathedral itself. Inside, there was no weaponry, only documents stacked neatly in oilskin packets. Maps, operational timetables, and, most importantly, detailed logistics for supply routes leading toward the northern I-Corps zone. This was critical intelligence, confirming a major forthcoming offensive operation targeting U.S. firebases. He swiftly secured the packets onto his webbing. The retrieval phase was complete, but the retreat was now the greater danger. The NVA knew he was down here. The intentional positioning of the pressure fuse charge wasn't just defense. It was a delaying tactic. He radioed a single, coded burst back to Davies. Package secure. Active engagement imminent. Now, the passive war of waiting was over. The active, desperate combat of survival began. He moved fast, crawling back through the cauldron, abandoning all pretense of absolute silence. He could hear distant, muffled sounds now. The unmistakable scrape of rifle butts against clay, the muted tread of boots. NVA counter-assault teams were entering the tunnel complex. He reached the foot of the 90-foot shaft, the rope dangling uselessly. He had to climb. The climb was brutal, sheer muscle failure magnified by exhaustion and the terror of being hunted in a chimney of earth. He pulled himself up, yard by painful yard, knowing a grenade dropped from above would end the mission and his life in a heartbeat. The 90-foot ascent was a blur of aching muscles and desperate gasps for the fresher air that lay tantalizingly above. As he neared the top, the surface sounds returned, louder, clearer, and more hostile. He could hear the shouts of U.S. perimeter security and the ragged, sharp reports of AK-47 fire indicating the NVA had breached the surface cordon near the entrance shaft. He was climbing directly into a firefight. He pulled himself over the lip of the concrete culvert just as a sharp, metallic ring sounded from one of the adjacent, smaller ventilation tubes. A dropped grenade. Mouse scrambled, rolling out onto the hot, humid jungle floor, pulling his body clear as the muffled thwomp of the fragmentation grenade echoed up from the earth. He lay gasping, the blinding daylight of brutal shock after the utter darkness of the deep. Davies rushed over, pulling Mouse clear of the staging area as heavy machine gun fire swept the perimeter. "Did you get it, Mouse?" Mouse, trembling violently, not from fear but from the physical and psychological toll of the silent war below, simply shoved the oilskin packets into Davies' hands. The waiting had been the most terrifying combat of his life. He looked back at the narrow, dark hole, the silent monument to 90 feet of terror, and knew that the deep, grinding quiet of the earth had extracted a price far heavier than any surface wound. The fight was over, but the nightmare of the hiss would be a sound he would carry forever.